Okay, I'm not going to be much of a moderator. I'm not even going to be seated among you. So I think maybe it would be helpful to see if there are questions among you for each other as a starting point, and then we'll just open it for general conversation with you. And again, I hope I'm somebody who comes from a tradition of like you hand people written questions, index cards, and I'm going to the drugstore at some point and buy a big pack of index cards so that those can be forwarded. Pardon me?
You want index cards?
I think for future it helps to have index cards so there's no repetition among.
So just ask for it.
Oh, okay. Where did I think I was? Yes.
Wow.
But just so, yeah.
What else would you think out there for us, right?
It makes for a certain efficiency of time to be able to condense questions or make sure there's no repetition. So,
I have a question. Can I
Please,
ask a
go
question?
ahead.
Okay, I have a question. So my question is, there is a big debate in Canada right now. So just FYI, Canadian EHR does not have race. Okay? Which, as an American who had a child in the UK also, right, I was like, it took 20 minutes for the doctors to convince me that there was no race. Like, I said, oh, it's in another database. He said, no, it doesn't exist. I said, no, it's recorded secretly by, the federal government. No, it doesn't exist. It does not exist. It is not recorded anywhere. This is terrifying to me as a machine learning researcher, because even though I don't want to use race as a biological category and predict things in specific race buckets, I need to be able to audit my model and say that it does equally well in people of different races. But that's sort of the ML hat on thought process. What do you guys think? There's a serious conversation right now about, do we include it? Do we not include it? What is its place in the electronic healthcare record?
So, it's on. Okay. So this is a discussion that happens in a lot of countries. So one thing is to move outside of the U.S. frame and thinking that the U.S. is like normal and its preoccupation with race ethnicity. It's not, number one. Number two, so for example, also you have to understand the political history of why countries don't. So France, for example, because of what happened in World War II and who was rounded up and sent to the death camps, that's why they have no data in their administrative systems. If you want to include racial ethnic data in a health study, there are special protocols you go through to be able to develop a data set in order to do that, precisely because of the misuse of race ethnicity. And we're about to see in the U.S. with the way, in the U.S. there was the case of the Japanese in World War II, where again, there was a violation of U.S. law around the U.S. Census about what number of years you're supposed to not have access to individual records. That was violated to be able to pick up the Japanese and put them in the internment camps. So it's again, first understanding politically why a country does or doesn't have those categories. Secondly, if it's for research purposes, what's done in terms of the confidentiality of the person so that they won't have bad things done to them, like count of the data that are recorded. And third, then, the other question is understanding if you don't have the access, what is done to be able to gain access for the purposes of research only that don't follow people for the rest of their life. But if it is baked into the data the way that we have it, to look at it both A, critically as the category, and B, to realize that it's only picking up one bit of what the variables are, and what are the other data that you would want to link in terms of, for example, the kinds of neighborhoods that people live in. Thinking about Toronto, lots of heterogeneity and lots of segregation in Toronto in relation to both race, ethnicity, nativity, immigration histories, and also income levels. So it's always that's a variable, but it's the beginning of a conversation with the data, not the end of it. So it's not seeing it as a shortcut that would do more than it ought to. So, but to understand why these are political contests is that there's a real history behind it, and a history with genocide.
Well, I would just add to that the question is, what is race being used for in the research? And how is it being defined? So there's a lot of research that goes on in the United States where race is used as a variable without any definition of what it means, who belongs to, how they decide who is in that category, and an assumption that it's a biological category. But if you assume instead that it is what it really is, a political category, and you are using it in order to understand, identify, measure, and end racism, then use it that way. But you have to figure out then how do I use it then in my design for that particular purpose. A lot of times race is being used as a proxy for something else. This is true in medicine. You know, you ask the doctor, why are you using race to treat this patient? Aren't there more important things? And they'll say, yeah, there are more important things, but I don't have time, or it's easy to use race, or I was taught to use race. And my answer to that is use the more important variable. But when it comes to racism, race is the important variable. So it really, I think, for all of us, whatever kind of researchers we are, being more careful about what this term means and how we're using it is really important. And as Nancy said, it's political. So, you know, we're using it for political purposes, and to acknowledge that and really criticize and explore and interrogate what those political purposes are is important. I'll just say one other thing about we might think, for example, that citizenship is an important category for the census, but we now know that the Trump administration wants to add it in order to deny voting rights. So, you know, again, what is it being used for? Because of that, I might ordinarily, in another context, say, oh, yeah, I think that's an important question. No, in the United States today, I don't want it in the census because I know what it's politically being used for.
First, I neglected to say that we do have publications in our work. My former postdoc would be very upset at what I said. But the book includes so much more that we can't do it in an article. So just to clarify that, I'm going to get flayed for this. Yeah, I agree with what you both have said. But I would recommend that you talk to Patrick Simon, who is in Paris, and they are, he's also working with the WHO and other and UN. He has proposed to use race categories in France. He has been treated like persona non grata because you just don't do it. It's just you do not do it. But he wants to measure discrimination. He's a sociologist, and he wants to measure discrimination. And so it's been a war. And I think it might be interesting, given your concerns, for you to talk to him what the situation is there. So I'll connect you. Okay.
And connecting these two comments just quickly to say is that then the question is, can you introduce measures of racism, structural racism, issues of racism in the health systems, so that the exposure variable is racism, for which you do need to have data on race ethnicity in terms of who is being targeted in what ways. But it's not, so it's that the individual level variable is the start of the conversation, but it's only the start because you need to get all the other kinds of variables. And it would be easy to go on at great length about what the many measures are that are available at different levels.
Sandal, I wanted to ask you, because I saw Emma, your student, give, I love that paper. I think it's fantastic. You're an economist. Like, what do you think about race inclusion and the separation? Because I think actually that paper is one of the examples of why I would want it recorded for the audit.
Yeah, and without answering, I might bounce this question to Cynthia. It seems eminently unfair to bounce it to you, but to build on what everyone else was saying, it seems like the use case dictates the data collection. The research use case has very different needs. Oh, sorry. The use case dictates data collection. The research use case has properties that we wouldn't, that make it easier to collect data than all the other cases, and I feel like your work and others has highlighted a little bit this issue that you can easily imagine trying to collect data, but we can do audits with very noisy measures of race. You can make the measures of race very, and just as a simple thought experiment, suppose when we went to collect data, there was a hardwired noising up of the race variable in all of the data sets. You can structure the noise in such a way that for purposes of audits, we have all the data we need. But for purposes of any other malfeasance in terms of people using it, it would become entirely useless. Those techniques have been used for other things, and people proposed them and so on. I'm curious whether you or others know whether this has been proposed or tried, because it seems, I mean, I'm not saying it's feasible, but at least it's on the boundary of proposable and doable. I don't know why I bounced that to you. That's just unfair. You don't have to answer that.
I haven't heard that specific proposal before, but there are a variety of cryptographic techniques that could come into play here. And I think it should be a really fruitful direction for, not just for investigation. I think that in theory, there are very good solutions. So that's very intriguing.
Let's throw it open to the audience. I actually do have index cards, but no easy distribution system yet. So I think for future sessions, I'll position them in some way that will be announced. But in the meantime, so you're first, Mark, 1, 2, 3.
So I just wanted to ask about if it's, in kind of seeing all the talks, if it's fair to say a main message of this being namely that, because I haven't seen it stated as a main message, I've seen a lot of problems be stated, so I just want to check if this is fair to say that we can't silo off any of the math ever when talking about things we're going to deploy into the world. We can't separate it off and say, okay, we're going to talk about the math now. There are many things we will always miss, and that we need to always have some demarginalized communities as part of the decision-making process. I guess when you were saying that, well, it seems maybe if we just have someone from that knows algorithms and someone from healthcare, then we're covered. But if you have someone from our healthcare system, which is kind of this individualistic system, then we don't have the communities that we need at the table when talking about this. So I guess where I'm coming from is like complexity theory. We talk about things very abstractly. We talk about something called worst case analysis. And when you want to talk about things that happen in the real world, you need to talk about how are the instances distributed. You need to get really specific, and we can brush that away because, you know, complexity theory, its importance is many degrees down the line. Whereas this, it feels like there's much more responsibility to be correct right now if we're putting stuff out into the world. So I just want to ask, can I say a main message of this is that we need to be very instance specific? Any
You mean context specific?
context specific for a specific problem that we're dealing with? I'm talking about healthcare, maybe carcerality, maybe whatever. I need to be, okay, I'm doing this specific task with this specific objective function. Let me find the specific people the marginalized people it will affect, and bring them into the discussion immediately.
I think that that's true for any application area. If you want to work in that area, you should have a really intense understanding of the system that generated the data you'll work on. One thing that I think is helpful is in the machine, so for computer science students, right? Often they get interested in an application area because they participate in a challenge of some kind, right? And one of the things I really liked at last NeurIPS, which is a big machine learning conference that happens in December, is there was a Google Inclusive Images Challenge. The team at Google spent a ton of time and effort to acquire photographs from around the world, many different diverse locations, have users tag, this is what a wedding looks like in India. So stop classifying my wedding as performance art in Google Images. This is real. It's classified as performance art right now. So, but they took the time and the effort to create that data set and make labels, and a bunch of people participated in that data set challenge, right? And so now there's a lot of students and professors who say, well, there's data there, this is an interesting topic, I'd like to engage with this, right? And so I think having people who have some subject matter knowledge make easy entry points so that you can understand, oh, there's all of this complexity, there's all of this difference, it is really valuable.
But are you talking as somebody who's creating algorithms?
Yeah, I guess part of it was some of the talks are depressing in the sense of, okay, besides just being depressing, it's like, okay, what next then? What do we do? Yeah. And I feel like a lot of computer scientists can be like, okay, what are the general rules I can make that will work always? And what I'm getting from the talks are there are no such ones. You need to look at the instance, bring in those specific marginalized people, and talk about the overall context that's being embodied.
So the one quick comment is I'm very supportive of what you're saying, but there's two things to add. One is that it's not like people who are quote-unquote marginalized all think the same. It depends on the analytic framework. And for example, having Justice Clarence Thomas on the U.S. Supreme Court, I'm not sure it does the trick. So, so I think it's...
That particular comment.
So it's real, and the other point is that it's all of our responsibilities to learn the history that's relevant. I'm a teacher, and I believe people can learn, and that's why I teach. It's my responsibility as a white person born in the United States to know deeply a lot of the very bad history of the U.S. and also the really good history of people trying to make it live up to what the original promises were supposed to be, and whose promises to whom, and who was excluded from that as well from the beginning. So in terms of indigenous rights and much else. So it's never, it can't just be put on the marginalized people, and it's about, and also recognizing again, real differences and real political fights and fights over turf and money are also very active. So not to have that be somehow like there's a unified community there, but not to take away from the responsibility of all of us to know that deeply the history engaged in that particular problem, and yes, context specific.
I would also say that one of the things that we're pushing for, at least at my university, is interdisciplinary collaborations. A lot of times it's just talk, but there is some real sincere effort. And I think that if you actually work with people in other fields and disciplines, I think you'll produce something that is much richer and useful and hopefully not harmful. So I highly recommend that. And that also means changing the structure of credit in academic work, and we need to change that too. That is, I think, slowly changing, but we need to work on that so if you look at the GUS big data studies, or unfortunately some of the sociogenomics big data studies, you'll see huge author lists. And they've figured out a way so that everyone can get credit. And so, learn from that so that you will get credit for your work, but you'll also get the advantage of collaborative input, expertise.
I just want to point out that your question is a great question, and it touches on a couple things. One is, what is the knowledge that's going into the creation of these algorithms? What are the assumptions? Who can contest those assumptions? Where do they come from? The politics we've all been talking about. But it also raises the question of who has authority to create them in the first place. And that's, I think we've touched on, the people who are going to be affected by them, which disciplines are going to control that. That's another political question. And they're related, but they're two different aspects that are really important. I'm glad you brought that up.
If I could add one quick thing. Yeah, I think I agree with most everything you've said, but I felt like you've omitted something which is also super important. That is, I think you described complexity theory as an example. It's not like the frameworks in complexity theory were born overnight. It took time for people to realize what were the abstractions and features that was relevant. We went from decidability to saying runtime to then maybe saying space matters. That is the evolution of a theory as it starts to get a sense of which abstractions are relevant and which abstractions can we absorb and leave aside. And I think it's just important to realize there are really fundamental theoretical questions here that over the next 10 years will be raised, which is, okay, so then what is a good model? What abstractions should be built in? What will generalize? So I share your spirit of saying, oh, wow, this is a very rough terrain, but I don't necessarily agree that where this ends up is in a bad place. This is what makes, if I were a young student, I'd be excited. This is where interesting theoretical frameworks are built, and this is where ideas, and it's just building it is going to be hard, and that's what everything here is being said, but that's what the excitement is, I think.
So my question builds on this, I think. I'd like, I'm over here. I'd like to ask, imagine that the people who are here could build a certification of responsible ML or algorithmic use. And I heard at least 6 characteristics. Tell me if I'm correct about this, but there might be more. The first is anything that is solely relying on data that is individualized is inadequate. There has to be systemic, ecological. Second is that there has to be scrutinizing constantly of proxies that are implicit, including cost to health, race to anything, et cetera. So there's this collision that happens a lot. The third is that there needs to be studies or factors of racism rather than race. So that's one form of the structural. The fourth is that there needs to be some kind of rebuilding of anything that is called genomic. And anything called genomic should not be used because it's actually built on a set of assumptions that are disguised. And I guess there's a question there, is that beyond genomics? Is that beyond GWAS? Is that to some other data sets that are also problematic? And the last, I guess that was 4, that privatized data is a big problem because then the auditing will become impossible. And so nobody should be willing to work with privatized data, and there should be a constant demand for at least access for public. And the last is that who designs the problem is pretty central. And so the participatory or governance accountability structures for problem design are central. So that's what I heard. Is that accurate? Am I missing something? And take, for example, on the genomic data, is it only genomic data that has this problem, or are there others?
We're working on blood now.
Blood also, okay.
I mean, I would add to that last specific point. I mean, any biological data needs to be contextualized. I mean, so you'll see that there will be the rush. You'll look at proteomics. You'll look at, I mean, right now there's a ton of work happening on the microbiome, for example. And there's incredible geographic, racial, ethnic, economic, you name it, heterogeneity, and it's all to be discovered right now. But to see it not as a product of the individuals themselves, but the context, and also how that relates to the food systems and the different imperatives around food systems that people are in, let alone also what's going into the wastewater, which is really important, which has to do with a lot with the antibiotics that are going on in different countries and different antibiotic loads, and what's happening in agriculture and cows, particularly, and chickens with the antibiotics. So you can't imagine a microbiome without thinking about a context for that. And the same would apply to the epigenetics research as well, in terms of trying to figure out. So I think that you'll see that anything that is an omic and that is
Or a bio.
is happening in real bodies, in real places, in real ecosystems, which are being politically shaped. And so that's the frame to bring to it, and I would not just say genomics alone.
Right.
So there's more to say, but just microbiome is a good place to hang your hat in that one right now.
But I could add to it neuroscience as well. So, yeah, right, exactly. So anything, I think you're right that it's something about biological explanations for the social problems that we're interested in addressing that need to be really scrutinized and contextualized. Even those new ways of thinking about social inequality affecting biology as opposed to biology producing social inequalities like epigenetics or the neuroscience of poverty, but they still often end up as biological explanations. And so, I think
There are framings in biology to do this. I mean, broadly read ecological evolutionary developmental sciences are a way of sort of saying how species even speciate, let alone what individuals do when they grow up being a member of their species and what's a species anyway. That if you don't understand context, you don't understand the biology. And you don't understand the expression of biology over time.
If I can pick up, Martha and I are on a board together, and she always says things in threes. So I was shocked. When I heard there were six. It must mean you're either half as interested about the board or twice as interested as what's going on here. So, anyway, that's neither here nor there. Well, I thought your list was awesome, and maybe I'll just pick up on one bit you said, because I think that's one that everyone here can start to contribute to, which is around getting data so that lots can compete on it. I think if I look outside of health, if you look at the carcerality work, it's shocking the thin data it's based on. And that's not anyone's fault, it's just that it's not available. Marzi and I are involved in something in health to try to break through it. And I'll pitch it because, as Marzi said we should, I thought her thing of vision and speech was a great way to see the difference. Beautiful way to see the difference. But I think the efforts being undertaken also illustrate what the bottleneck is, which is ultimately putting these data together is just a public good. And there's just a lot of work. So over the last few months, we have a project called Nightingale, who, I don't know if you guys knew this, but she was actually a data scientist and a statistician.
Yes.
It's kind of amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah, pretty amazing. But nevertheless, so the idea is, why should big private providers that we won't name, but who rhyme with Google, why should they go and acquire these private data and then kind of not be able to share? It's like, how will the community progress? So we've been going to hospitals and health systems and saying, what if you were to try and let us do all the data engineering and put up some of your data in a secure platform for research use? And I'll say that you don't want to count chickens before they hatch, but we've certainly got some eggs. I don't think this metaphor is working. We've gotten enough interest from enough health systems that I think it's actually promising. And I think there's information there, which is, I think, if people in this room are willing to pay the sweat equity, if funders are willing to pay the dollar equity, I do think that in these crucial areas, and it's not much. I mean, if you think in the grand scheme of things, it's, 16% of the economy? So, a tiny drop in the human capital and financial capital bucket, I think in many of these areas could transform these areas if people are willing to play that public good role. So I think that's important.
I'm actually going to ask you to hold your question.
Sure.
I'm sorry. We're on such a tight schedule, and this panel, because it had 5 panelists, has taken a little bit more time. We'll see if we're
Can they send them to us?
Yes, that's what I was going to suggest. I think if you would please put your questions on.
You're very non-strict in this institute. Since I joined,
You and Cynthia have to work this out then, because Cynthia did the knife motion.
take 15 minutes off lunch, just to give 5 more minutes each panel. I think that's fine.
Okay, we can do that.
Yeah, we have taken 15 minutes off of lunch, so let me just think your rules.
Well, may I suggest something? I was going to suggest that actually.
We're fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Can I say this is definitely representative of the Harvard MIT class schedules? Because at MIT they start like 10 minutes like nobody cares, but yeah.
Martha,
what
can
I
you
would
send your list to all of us?
Yeah.
Thank you.
What I was going to suggest is that those who have unanswered questions, please put them on these, and then we'll make some time. We also have some extra time at the end in which we are going to address those questions which still hang. And most people, not everybody, but most people will still be here by the end, and so that might be a way to resolve the question of hunger versus hunger for knowledge as opposed to hunger for sustenance. So why don't we just call it a day right now, and by the next session we will have worked out a better system of back and forth around the questioning.
So please come back by 1:15.
Okay, great.